This is the story of how one of Disney's most beloved fairy tales evolved from a story about rape and cannibalism into the romanticized princess movie we know today. What you grew up watching as Sleeping Beauty bears almost no resemblance to the tale that started it all. Disney's 1959 release brought audiences a beautiful princess named Aurora, cursed by the evil Maleficent, protected by 3 good fairies, and awakened by true love's kiss from Prince Philip. Everything about it felt elegant, romantic, and magical. But the story didn't originate with Walt Disney, and it didn't start with the Brothers Grimm either. These origins stretch back more than 3 centuries to a version so disturbing that nobody would tell it to children today. We need to start at the beginning, back in 1634, with a writer named Giambattista Basile. Between 1634 and 1636, Basile published his version of the Sleeping Princess tale in a collection called Pentamerone, also known as the Tale of Tales. Sun, Moon and Talia is what he called his story, and from the very first page, this was never meant for children. No princess in a castle appears in Basile's version, and no evil fairy exists. Fortune tellers predict that a young woman named Talia will be harmed by a splinter of flax. Her father tries to prevent this, but eventually Talia gets a splinter of flax stuck under her fingernail and falls into a death-like sleep. Unable to bear the sight of her apparent death, her father places her body in one of his estates and abandons the castle entirely. Alone on a velvet throne in an empty building, Talia sits unconscious, and that's where the story takes its darkest turn. A lord, not a prince, goes out hunting one day when his falcon flies into the abandoned castle. Searching for his bird, he enters and discovers Talia's body, tries to wake her but cannot, and here's where Basile's version becomes truly shocking. Rape is what happens next. The Lord assaults Talia while she is unconscious, and then he leaves. Talia remains asleep through it all. 9 months later, still unconscious, she gives birth to twins named Sun and Moon, and one of the infants tries to nurse, sucks on Talia's finger instead, and draws out the flax splinter, which finally wakes her. Awakening to find herself alone with 2 babies she didn't know she'd had, fathered by a man she never met while conscious, Talia confronts a reality too horrible to comprehend. The story continues from there, and here's where it gets worse. Eventually the Lord returns to the castle and finds Talia awake with his children, tells her what happened, and in Basile's telling, they begin a relationship, but the problem is that the Lord is already married. Discovery comes when his wife learns about the affair and the existence of the children. Consumed by jealousy, she orders her cook to kill Sun and Moon and serve them to her husband for dinner. But the cook can't bring himself to commit such an act, so he hides the children and serves lamb instead. Demanding that Talia be brought to the castle, the wife plans to burn her alive. At the last moment, the Lord intervenes and throws his wife into the fire instead, marries Talia, and the cook reveals that the children are still alive. Everyone except the murdered wife lives happily ever after. That's the story that started the Sleeping Beauty tradition, featuring rape, attempted infanticide, attempted murder, and actual murder all wrapped into one tale. 17th century Italy produced this for adult aristocratic audiences, where such dark themes were common in literature of the period. 63 years later, in 1697, a French writer named Charles Perrault decided to retell this story. Stories or tales of past times is where his version appeared, under the title The Sleeping Beauty in the Wood, or La Belle au Bois Dormant. In the original French, Perrault made changes that mattered deeply, transforming the fortune tellers into 7 fairies. He changed the flax splinter into a curse involving a spinning wheel, replaced the unnamed lord with a prince, And most importantly, Perrault removed the rape. Falling into her enchanted sleep after pricking her finger on a spindle in Perrault's version, just as the curse foretold, the princess waits 100 years until a prince arrives at the castle and finds her. Depending on which telling of Perrault's version you read, either he kisses her or she simply awakens naturally because the 100 years have elapsed at the exact moment he arrives. But either way, the awakening is no longer the result of childbirth, and it's consensual, or at least not violent. Love follows, the prince and princess marry and have 2 children, and the story could end here as a typical fairy tale. But Perrault wasn't finished. A second part came next, revealing that the prince's mother is an ogress, a creature who eats human flesh. Perrault describes how while her son is away at war, she orders the castle cook to kill her 2 grandchildren and serve them to her for dinner. Just like in Basile's version, the cook cannot bring himself to do it and substitutes animal meat instead, demanding next that her daughter-in-law be killed and cooked as well. The ogress faces refusal again from the cook, and when she discovers the deception, she prepares a vat filled with vipers and venomous creatures, intending to throw her grandchildren and daughter-in-law into it. Returning just in time, the prince witnesses his mother's rage, and the ogress, in despair, throws herself into the vat instead. Less violent than Basile's because there was no rape, and the cannibalism was attempted, but never successful, Perrault's version was still dark. Written for the court of Louis XIV, for educated adults who appreciated moral lessons wrapped in fantastical stories, these weren't bedtime stories for children. More than a century later, in 1812, 2 German brothers changed everything, publishing their version of the Sleeping Princess in Children's and Household Tales. Their famous collection of fairy tales, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm called it Little Briar Rose, or Dornröschen in German. Scholars and philologists, they initially collected these tales for academic and folkloric purposes, gathering stories from oral traditions throughout Germany. But over time, they recognized that their collection was being read by families and children. So they began revising the tales to make them appropriate for young audiences. Reflection of this intention appears completely in their version of Sleeping Beauty. 12 wise women, essentially fairies, receive invitations to celebrate a princess's birth in the Grimm version, existing but uninvited because the king only has 12 golden plates for the feast. A 13th wise woman arrives anyway, angry at being excluded, and curses the princess to die on her 15th birthday by pricking her finger on a spindle. Softening the curse, because she cannot undo it entirely, the 12th wise woman, who hasn't yet given her blessing, changes death to a sleep lasting 100 years. Efforts to prevent the curse fail despite the king ordering all spindles in the kingdom destroyed, and the princess finds one on her 15th birthday and pricks her finger. Sleep overtakes her, everyone else in the castle follows, and a hedge of thorns grows around the entire palace. Arrival comes exactly 100 years later, when a prince appears. Parting for him without him having to cut through them, the thorns allow him to enter the sleeping castle, find the princess, and kiss her, which awakens her along with everyone else in the castle, leading to marriage and happily ever after. That's the entire story, nothing more. Removal of the ogress mother-in-law subplot came entirely from the Grimm brothers, along with any hint of sexual violence, and they made the story short, magical, and appropriate for children. Revisions followed multiple times in 1819, 1837, 1840, 1843, 1850, and 1857, with each edition becoming increasingly family-friendly. Most people think of this as the original Sleeping Beauty when they hear the tale. But even this version contains elements that make modern readers uncomfortable, like a prince kissing an unconscious woman and a princess with no agency who sleeps through her own story, waiting passively for rescue. Still, compared to Basile's rape and Perrault's cannibalistic ogress, the Grimm version seems almost innocent. And that's when Disney entered the picture. Beginning in 1951 at Walt Disney Animation Studios, production on their version of Sleeping Beauty stretched nearly 8 years before completion, an extraordinarily long production time even by Disney standards, and the film finally released on January 29, 1959. $6 million is what Disney's budget reached, translating to roughly $62 million in today's money. Filming it in Super Technirama, 70mm, the studio made it the first Disney animated feature shot in 70mm widescreen, and the art style drew inspiration from medieval tapestries and pre-Renaissance art, giving it a distinctive look unlike any previous Disney film. Basing their version primarily on Perrault's 1697 telling rather than the Grimm version, Disney made substantial changes anyway. Aurora became the princess's name, though she also goes by Briar Rose. Receiving a name for the first time in Disney history, the prince became Prince Philip, along with an actual personality, and the three good fairies became Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather, each with distinct characteristics, creating one of Disney's most iconic villains in Maleficent, the evil fairy who curses Aurora. The studio made decisions that mattered. Complete removal of the second half of Perrault's story meant the ogress mother-in-law never appears. Expanding Maleficent's role instead, they transformed her into a powerful sorceress who ultimately turns into a dragon for the film's climactic battle. And Prince Philip became an active hero who fights his way through thorns and flames to reach Aurora, rather than simply arriving at the convenient moment. Specificity defined the curse in their version. Pricking her finger on a spinning wheel spindle before sunset on her 16th birthday would cause Aurora to fall into a death-like sleep, and only true love's kiss could break the spell. Raising Aurora in hiding in the forest, the three good fairies kept her away from all spinning wheels, but Maleficent eventually finds her, and the curse is fulfilled. Romanticization, beautification, and suitability for children defined everything. True love's kiss became the answer. The villain faced defeat, and good triumphed over evil. Considered an artistic masterpiece today, the film was a financial disappointment initially, earning approximately $5,300,000 in its first release, not enough to recoup its $6 million budget. The underperformance led Disney to reduce its animation staff significantly. So impactful was the commercial failure of Sleeping Beauty that Disney didn't produce another animated fairy tale for 30 years. Arrival of The Little Mermaid wouldn't happen until 1989. Success came with later re-releases of Sleeping Beauty, and the film has since become recognized as a classic. But in 1959, audiences weren't ready for such an expensive, artistically ambitious animated feature. Tracing this evolution clearly now reveals the pattern. Writing in 1634, Giambattista Basile created a story about a woman raped while unconscious, who gives birth to twins while still asleep, and whose awakening leads to attempted infanticide and murder. Refining the story in 1697, Charles Perrault removed the rape, but kept the cannibalistic ogress and the attempts to murder the protagonist's children. Sanitizing it further in 1812, the Brothers Grimm created a simple tale of a cursed princess 100-year sleep, and a prince's awakening kiss that was suitable for children, but still featured an unconscious woman being kissed. Transformation into a romance about true love. Conquering evil came from Disney in 1959, complete with a heroic prince, a dragon battle, and a happily ever after ending. Reshaping the story to fit their audience and their values, is what each generation did with the material they inherited. Facing criticism today, even Disney's version comes under scrutiny. Questioning the consent implied in a prince kissing an unconscious woman, modern audiences examine the passive role of Aurora, who spends most of her own movie asleep with no agency over her fate. And discussions about female representation in fairy tales often point to Sleeping Beauty as an example of problematic narratives where women wait to be rescued rather than taking action themselves. Valid as contemporary concerns, they're part of how stories continue to evolve, but understanding where Sleeping Beauty came from puts these concerns in perspective, because Disney's version, for all its flaws by modern standards, was a radical sanitization of a story that originally featured rape and attempted child murder. Dramatic improvement came with the Grimm brothers' version over Perrault's cannibalistic ogress, and Perrault's version at least removed the unconscious rape that defined Basile's original. Movement in one direction for nearly 400 years defines this story's journey, away from violence and toward romance, away from horror and toward magic, away from adult entertainment and toward children's storytelling. The transformation continued across centuries, resulting from centuries of writers, storytellers, and artists deciding what elements to keep and what to discard. Sleeping Beauty, as we know it today, evolved from Basile's dark tale of violation and revenge into Perrault's cautionary story with fantastical elements, which became the Grimm brothers' simple, magical fable, which became Disney's celebration of true love. Same title, same basic premise of a sleeping princess who awakens, but the meaning, the tone, and the message transformed completely. Remaining static over time is something stories never do. Making choices about what matters, what resonates, and what should be passed down is what each culture, each generation, each storyteller does with the material. And the shocking truth about Sleeping Beauty isn't just that the original was dark. It's that we've collectively decided over and over again that the darkness wasn't the part worth keeping. Keeping the magic, keeping the sleep and the awakening, keeping the idea of a curse and its breaking. We discarded the rape, the cannibalism, the violence, and the horror. Barely recognizable compared to the story Basile told in 1634, the story we tell our children today about Sleeping Beauty might not represent a failure of accuracy, working exactly as stories are supposed to work, carrying forward the elements that speak to us, letting go of the elements that don't, and trusting each generation to shape the tales that matter into something meaningful for their time. The evolution continues. That's the true origin of Sleeping Beauty, not just where it came from, but how it changed and why we changed it.